Problem 22-38, we're going to prepare the manufacturing overhead budget now. So we want to enter any per unit amounts to 2 decimal places. Abbreviations used are VOH, variable manufacturing overhead, FOH, fixed manufacturing overhead. And in the previous videos, I think I failed to mention that these links that we have here open up our production budget and our direct labor budget, so we don't have to scroll back up and down. However, please note, these links are only available in the homework. However, in the tests and the pre-tests, they won't be available here, so you'll need to scroll. Because if you had the links, it would give you the solution. So before we do this section of the budget, let's review what we're working on right now. We're working on the manufacturing overhead budget. Again, these are the costs of making the production that are not direct materials and they are not direct labor. It could include things like indirect materials, but for this problem, they said indirect materials were insignificant. So this company does not budget for indirect materials. But they could be costs related to manufacturing the products, such as electricity for the factory, insurance for the factory, depreciation for the factory, and machines in the factory, and other things like property taxes for the factory, etc. So now let's get started on our manufacturing overhead budget. So the first thing we need to know is our budgeted batts to be produced in this field here. So we'll use that. And those are in the production budget. So budgeted batts to be produced right down here for the 1,300 for the youth batts, 2,700 for adult batts, for a total of 4,000 batts. Make sure you're looking at produced and not sold. That's very important here. So let's go ahead and input those numbers. So again, that's 1,300 youth batts and 2,700 adult batts. So that's a total of 4,000 batts that we will need. So again, you can use this view production budget link here during the homework, however, not during the pre-tests and tests. So just keep that in mind. So the next thing we need to calculate is the variable manufacturing overhead per batt, this VOH. Now, some overhead costs are variable, meaning that the batts you produce, the more overhead there is. So this could be anything like electricity for the machines that create and manufacture the batts. So the more batts you make, the longer machines are used, and the more electricity they use. Therefore, it is a variable overhead cost. So let's see in our additional data box here if we can find the variable overhead information. Let's move this over here. So it says under H, variable manufacturing overhead is 75 cents per batt. So that's going to be for both the youth and the adult batts. And remember, at the end, we are not adding these together. This is just the VOH, the variable overhead cost per batt. So that's 75 cents. So then to get the budgeted VOH, that variable overhead, we're going to take these 1,300 youth batts here and multiply by the variable overhead cost per batt. And we'll do the same for the adult batts. We'll multiply the budgeted batts to be produced at 2,700 times that VOH cost per batt of 75 cents. So let's go ahead and start out by getting the budgeted VOH for the youth batts. That is going to be 975. We'll go across to the adult batts. We're doing the same, and that is going to give us 2,025 there. And then this one, you can either add the budgeted variable overhead across this way for the youth and adult batts, or you can just take this total of 4,000 and multiply that by 0.75. And that is going to give us a total of 3,000 budgeted variable overhead. So we now have our budget for our variable overhead costs. However, there are some overhead costs that are fixed. So these fixed overhead costs here. So for example, we have fixed manufacturing that includes this depreciation and insurance and property taxes. So we can go ahead and take a look at I here for that. So that fixed manufacturing overhead includes $1,000 per quarter in depreciation. And notice this is per quarter here, same amount. So it looks like they're using straight line depreciation. and then $2,000 per quarter for other costs such as insurance and property taxes. So these will stay the same throughout each quarter whether we make any money or not. So let's put in our depreciation. So that was given to us for $1,000 per quarter. And those insurance and property taxes are $2,000 per quarter. And then that's going to give us total budgeted fixed overhead of $3,000. So next we have our budgeted manufacturing overhead costs. So this is our variable overhead costs plus the fixed overhead. So that's going to be this total VOH of $3,000 plus this total budgeted FOH. So fixed overhead, variable overhead added together. So that's $3,000 here, $3,000 here, or a total of $6,000. So that's budgeted manufacturing overhead costs right there. So now remember, with these $6,000 for the budgeted manufacturing overhead costs, we need to calculate the predetermined overhead allocation rate so later we can figure out how much to allocate to each bat. So to calculate the predetermined overhead allocation rate, we have to calculate the total direct labor hours. So the direct labor hours can be found up here in the direct labor budget. We've already prepared that. That's the one right before this one, but we can also grab them from here. So we have the direct labor hours needed for production. That's that 325 for the youth bats and 675 for the adult bats for a total of 1,000. So again, if this was a test, we would not have this little link here, so we'd have to scroll back up and then find that direct labor budget, and then find the direct labor hours needed for production. Again, they can be found here. 325, 675 for a total of 1,000. So let's go ahead and get those in here. So direct labor hours, again, 325 for youth bats and 675 for the adult bats for a total of 1,000 hours. So next we need to bring down the budgeted manufacturing overhead costs, and notice they're right here. This budgeted manufacturing overhead cost of 6,000. So we'll input that here for budgeted manufacturing overhead costs. And then now to calculate our predetermined overhead allocation rate. I've got the breakdown of how we do it here. We take this 6,000 budgeted manufacturing overhead costs, and of course this came from up here. And then we divide that by the direct labor hours, this 1,000 hours. So that's 6,000 divided by 1,000 gives us 6. So our predetermined overhead allocation rate is $6 per bat of overhead per 1 hour of direct labor. So again, we're getting the $6 here, 6.00. It did tell us at the beginning to put it to 2 decimal places as well. So let's go ahead and close out of our calculator and check our answer. Excellent. So in the next video, we will prepare Salma Batting Company's cost of goods sold budget.